All right. Let's get fired up here.
Maximum freedom. Read.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom.
Stay on target.
Maximum freedom. Read Rothbard.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Actual Anarchy podcast. This is episode 50 and can be found at actualanarchy.com/50. This is going to be about the Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which is a holiday-type Thanksgiving, trying to get home for the holiday movie. So we're going to release this Sunday before Thanksgiving, and we hope that your trip is not nearly as trying as is depicted in this film. And I hope that you enjoy this episode for your travels. You can listen to while you're traveling. Also, I wanted to mention that we're going to be doing a Thanksgiving special, and that will be with Dr. Walter Block discussing Poverty, Inc. And we thought that was a good movie to do for the Thanksgiving holiday, so we will release that on the Wednesday right before Thanksgiving. So you'll have a chance to listen to that during Thanksgiving or the day after or the long weekend. And then we'll be doing another show after that. So a lot of shows coming at you this week. I think that the Sunday after Thanksgiving was going to be Founder, which is the Ray Kroc story about McDonald's, starring Michael Keaton. So that should be a really good one. And let me tell you a little bit about a story about a man named Jed. No, I'm just kidding. We have a project we've been working on called the Libertarian Union. And what that is it's a series of podcast providers in the ANCAP and Libertarian style that have joined forces in a voluntary union. Secession is totally legitimate in this union, and it's 8 different providers: Don't Waste Your Hate, Liberty Weekly, Battle for Liberty, the Actual Anarchy podcast, Wizardly Wisdom, the ANCAP Barbershop, among others. And you can find all of those shows listed at libertarianunion.com, and also check out the new artwork. We just updated logos and Facebook pages and all that at facebook.com/libertarianunion1, and that's the number 1 at the end of that.
In the early days of the internet, radical libertarians were scattered, lonely, and faceless. Without direction, they resigned to scour the web, sifting through content providers in a wasteland plagued by YouTube demonetization, Facebook jail, and covert internet censorship. But then, in 2017, the Libertarian Union was formed. Finally, the average Joe libertarian could find a thriving community of independent podcasters and content providers, all in one convenient location. At Libertarian Union, we'll always have the latest news, interviews, discussions, and even movie reviews. With hundreds of episodes and more added all the time, you'll always find something fresh at libertarianunion.com.
All right, as I said in the intro, this is actualanarchy.com/50, our 50th episode. So, break out that champagne and pop the cork on that. And we're getting into the holiday season, so we're doing Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, all about traveling home for Thanksgiving. Hopefully your travels are much, much better than as depicted in this film. And we have a returning guest. He was with us for our 310 to Yuma episode, which can be found at actualanarchy.com/37. It's the Professional Asshole. So, Mr. Asshole, go ahead and just remind the folks who you are and what you do, and then we'll get into the Google description and talk about this movie.
Well, howdy. I'm, again, Professional Asshole, and I am a private investor, accountant, general pain in people's asses, and discoverer of bullshit. So that is what I do professionally.
All right, very good, sir. And you also write for us at the site. There's a number of articles you've written, and including one infamous one that I was reluctant to publish.
Yeah, please don't.
It went a little far in a certain direction, and I didn't want to suffer any repercussions from that.
Yeah, no, it's probably better that we didn't publish that one. I just, it was just for the audience to know. It was I had to go sit down and listen to an IRS agent discuss his tactics for ensnaring people, usually over, and this was over relatively minor violations with regard to what the guy found. I mean, he was accused of running a pill mill, mostly for Viagra, which, you can make all the claims you want morally about whether or not you think that's a good thing. Personally, it's a victimless crime, so I couldn't care less. But the violation for which the IRS agent had tagged this guy over was relatively minimal. It was like, $10,000 by digging through this guy's trash for 2 years until he found enough cash envelopes to know, okay, this guy hasn't technically reported all of his income. Not that he hadn't reported a ton of it, because he had, but just he hadn't reported all of it. And so he wasn't arrested for, the pill mill stuff. It was for not paying his taxes. And of course, it didn't even work out anyways. The guy was very gung-ho about kicking in this guy's door, in the early hours of the morning and terrorizing his young children and his wife, who were completely innocent, and leaving them destitute. And the money ended up going not to, victims of Viagra overdose or anything like that, for this guy's abominable crime of erection giving, but was for right, like the guy openly admitted, as though there were no problem with this, no conceivable problem with the issue, that this money is going to his particular unit of the IRS so that he can buy new interdiction bans and new weapons. And he was even saying, I'm gonna get like new Rolexes and new things like this, so that when I go on Facebook Market and try to find scammers and things like that, I can have a believable fake account and things like that. I'm just like, is this guy supposed to be the good guy? Are you kidding me? This guy's just he's a mafia boss that pretends to, work for the government.
Yeah, well, they're the biggest gang. And speaking of gangs, isn't that how they nailed Al Capone? Wasn't it some financial type tax evasion thing or something like that?
Yeah, it was just non-reporting of income. They figured, well, we can't get him on anything else, but we know this guy's making like $5 million a year, but he's only reporting, say, 500,000 of it or something like that.
Yeah, and then Geraldo broke into his vault famously, and the big nothing burger in there.
Right, exactly. Well, you can't win them all,
like a
I guess.
really good article. Why didn't we put it up?
My language on it, like the way I went after this guy, it got personal. It was not just, he's a jerk and blah blah blah. It was, I accused the guy of like something. It just I went over the top, and I was mostly just an angry rant on my part that I turned into a semi-grammatical mess, and it was better that it not be published. And again, it's just something that we talk about amongst each other, and I could give you the details, but yeah, no, I don't want this thing published. I don't want anybody else to see it. It was nasty. It was just straight up,
Well, don't you think that the prisoner population of the United States has a vested interest in knowing what kind of scumbags these people are?
I think they do, but the problem is, this is the kind of thing that could get me and everybody else in trouble. So I'm thinking of myself. I'm being a selfish jerk.
Oh, okay. Well, if you're just being selfish about it, that's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's being a good capitalist here.
Exactly. I'm worrying about myself and my family, and saying, hey, if you wanna kiss the IRS's ass, well, go ahead, as long as I don't have to. So.
All right.
All right. Well, let's turn to a more cheery subject, and that is the John Candy and Steve Martin movie. Everyone cool with that?
Oh yeah.
Debatable.
Well, it is cheery. You know what?
It's debatable.
I got to find the Google description real quickly here. One moment. I had a series of other windows open, and for whatever reason, it got changed. So planes, trains, and automobiles, that's what we're talking about. And I believe this is a John Hughes movie.
It is.
From 1987 or so.
That's the year I was born.
Sounds about right.
Holy cow, you're a youngin', man.
I know. I don't look it.
All right, so here's the Google description. Planes, Trains, Automobiles, 1987 drama road movie, 1 hour, 33 minutes, and it plays a lot longer than that, I'll tell you that. 7.6 on IMDb, 92% Rotten Tomatoes, and 4 out of 4 from Roger Ebert back when he was around, and 92% of Google users like and approve of this movie or suggest it, recommend it. And the description reads as the easily excitable Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, is somewhat of a control freak. Trying to get home to Chicago to spend Thanksgiving with his wife and kids, his flight is rerouted to a distant city in Kansas because of a freak snowstorm, and his sanity begins to fray. Worse yet, he is forced to bunk up with the talkative Del Griffith, played by John Candy, whom he finds extremely annoying. Together, they must overcome the insanity of holiday travel to reach their intended destination. Came out right around Thanksgiving of 1987. Director John Hughes. Of course, it's a Chicago movie. That's kind of his shtick. Any qualms with any of the Google description from you, Robert?
Well, I wouldn't say that Steve Martin plays a control freak. I think he plays a guy that's just trying to get home. I don't know if he has a whole lot of different personality quirks or main personality points that you would point to and go, oh, this guy's this or that. He just seems like a normal dude to me that is dealing with this John Candy character. I mean, his character was revealed by having to deal with John Candy, but I think most anybody would have dealt with John Candy in the same way he did. He didn't strike me as a particularly unreasonable person.
Yeah, what do you say there, asshole?
I actually appreciate Neil Page just because he is the upper middle class, sort of gentried account executive type guy that I myself am, and I have a lot of similar personality traits with regard to being relatively introverted, straightforward. He's talking on the plane about how he wants to read in a financial magazine a article that his friend wrote, and I've had friends write articles in financial magazines and things like that. So it's just like I'm sitting there thinking, man, this Neil Page is relatively similar to myself, and not thinking, oh, this guy's such a jerk. He's just but I guess maybe to a working class stiff who has to get his life on by being a salesman, by being gregarious or something like that, then I might be seen as like this cynical, stiff, upper-lipped sort of a asshole that nobody likes compared to the guy who just loves getting a Coors Light while watching NFL at a bar or something like that.
Yeah. Do you see that there's maybe a bit of a class clash here? It's like the Odd Couple kind of thing. You got this upper middle class guy and this more blue collar. Though I mean, he is a traveling salesman, right? He's a showering vice president of sales or marketing or something like that.
Yeah, right. They've always got a title like that. Yeah, no, absolutely, and I do see the clash that you're talking about, and I think, I mean, even the way that Neil is dressed compared to Del. Del's got like this parka on and a tweed sort of a jacket, and he shops at a big and tall store out in the Pacific Northwest, as he mentions, and Neil's got this classic three-piece suit, but he's got his overcoat, top hat, and the thing he's worried about at the beginning of the movie is getting his gloves back, right?
Right. And he's got
his expensive leather gloves, and he's got a nice watch and all that.
Right, which is kind of a garish watch. They show a close-up of it, and I'm like, wow, how could you even tell the time on that thing? But
yeah, exactly. No, it was definitely for show and not for anything useful.
Right, and it plays a pivotal role a little bit later on in the movie. But another thing related to the class, you mentioned he shops at this big and tall in the Pacific Northwest that has a chain of like 5 or 6 stores. That came up because that's his only credit card.
Right? Yeah, no, and what's funny to me is even people who make, say, like $50,000 a year household income will usually have multiple credit cards these days, as opposed to back then, and this was even true in the mid-'90s. My father was, fairly well-to-do back then, and he had maybe 2 credit cards in the mid-'90s. Certainly in the '80s, he only would have had 1, and it probably would have been a gold card. And then later, when he was making even more money, they finally upped him to a platinum card. I don't even see platinum cards anymore. I just see higher and higher limits.
Yeah, it seems as if they've sort of lost the distinction between what's a gold, what's a platinum, and what's a black card. I've gotten a few of those offers, and I'm like, oh, that looks cool. $500 a year, no thanks.
Yeah, right. Or minimums of like $10,000 a quarter or something. So
yeah, indeed. So one of the other things, well, should we start going scene by scene? Because we sort of open with Steve Martin's character in a meeting in New York with like high-level executives looking at a marketing campaign, and the meeting's just dragging on, and they're, I guess it would be the CEO, is trying to make a decision between 3 options of the artwork, and Steve Martin's got to get to the plane, but the meeting's just dragging on and on.
Right. Yeah. I did think it was interesting how he's supposed to be the guy that can tolerate any amount of nuisance at the beginning. Because he even says later when he's talking with Del, like, I could sit in insurance seminars for days with a smile on my face, and they ask me how I can do it, right? And, we'll get to that later, but it's, this guy's supposed to be able to tolerate just about any amount of subtle pain in the ass type considerations where somebody's being indecisive, or somebody's being a nuisance, or somebody's, making a decision just out of pure habit and emotion as opposed to like by some sort of an analytical basis. And yet it's finally Del Griffith that just destroys him.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that the difference there is that he has to look up to the CEO because he works for the guy, versus Del doing something similar, maybe even more annoying, but he can sort of unleash his fury on Del that maybe he had pent up against his boss. I don't know. I'm sort of drawing a connection there that maybe is not there.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, with Dell, there's certainly he makes mistakes that. I mean, I guess I would say, when a CEO or somebody who is educated and intelligent makes a mistake, it's usually going to be something like, misses or glosses over, a piece of information, and this causes, a negative turnaround, but doesn't necessarily affect your daily life, as opposed to Dell. The kind of mistakes he makes are leaving, 6 packs of beer on a vibrating bed, which then explodes all over Neil, and suddenly he's got to sleep the night in beer, and piss-warm beer.
So, Robert, what do you have from the beginning of the movie? We got that Kevin Bacon scene, so that's part of that 6 degrees of separation going on, and he's doing his footloose running through the streets to try to beat Neil to the cab.
Yeah, the only thing I would have would be that this is pre-smartphones, pre-Uber. This is the government controlling the number of taxis in New York City with medallion system. So even though there were a surprisingly comically small number of taxi cabs on the street for New York City at this peak time, I think this would be the time when all the taxi cabs would be out searching for their high ticket, fares. But for the sake of the movie, they're just they need to have the scene where there's only like one to go around at this particular time. And I would just say that the government artificially restricts the number of taxi cabs. So Uber would solve all these problems, or getting out of the way of the market would also solve these problems.
Right, because this is one of those peak times when there's a higher demand for such a thing, and there's no surge pricing involved with the taxis as there would be with Uber. So you've got a whole lot more demand, but no real market response to that. And so there is this shortage that results, and he's even willing to bargain with another guy who had hailed a cab for the right to use the cab. And I think it gets up to $50, and he goes, well, a man who would pay $50 would certainly pay $75, which seemed a little bit sketchy to me because they just agreed on $50. But then John Candy just isn't aware of this, and he just hops in and uses the cab, and then Steve Martin runs after it, all upset and angry. But my whole thought during the whole movie, with many of the scenes, is that technology solves this. This movie wouldn't be believable if made today, so it sort of ages a lot, because like you'd said, smartphones, easy credit or multiple credit cards, like we mentioned, like they're more available now. Uber,
or you
other
pay,
things.
Yeah, you pay with your smartphone. Well,
right, yeah, would make this obsolete, this entire premise of this movie. And one other note I want to make, and then I'll let the asshole jump in. This is also related to the class sort of angle on this, because I'm being a good Marxist for Thanksgiving here. It's curious to me that Steve Martin doesn't take the subway. And if anyone's familiar with the New York City in the 80s, that's when the subway was full of graffiti, full of gang activity, really run down, really terrible. And this is a guy who has a first-class ticket on the airplane. So it totally makes sense to me that he would not take the subway to get to the airport.
Yeah, and that's where Rudy Giuliani made a lot of his fame, was by cleaning up the subways by doing what he called it wasn't the broken window fallacy, but it was the broken window rule. And in this case, it was, if you tolerate people breaking windows at night, if you tolerate them breaking a small crime, then they're likely to assume that the rule of law does not exist and therefore willing to take a big crime. Whereas if you arrest people for breaking windows, then suddenly, the graffiti disappears and the crime disappears in addition, and blah, blah, blah. Mostly he just had a major police crackdown, but, and mostly on people like homeless people and things like that. But you're right about the subways in the 1980s being a real problem. It's funny to me that I think if you were to remake this movie today, you'd have to be doing it where people are the problem, not the technology, right? Or it'd have to be the government involvement with it. So, almost every aspect of air travel that Neil suffers, the timing with regard to taxis, the getting in on plane or the delay, all that stuff has been improved minimally by technology. He could have gotten a text alert that his flight was delayed. He could have gotten, complaints, or he would have just had his ticket on his phone. All those things would have been figured out long ago. The only thing that's changed is that now we have the TSA, making security not only useless and mostly theater, but also long and arduous. And we have in New York, you're going to have to, like if they were to remake this movie today, it'd be something like, well, Uber did exist, except, because there was a recent crackdown on Uber by the police. None of the Uber drivers have the sticker on the window, and therefore he accidentally got in the wrong car because the Uber driver arrived but didn't have a sticker, so he gets in the wrong car and it's going to the wrong airport. It'd be things like that. That would be how you'd portray the movie today, as opposed to back then, where it's, conceivably you just have, incompetency and a lack of efficiency by all the companies involved.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's one thing that really stood out and bugged me about this movie was just the lackadaisical nature of customer service in this movie. It seemed like nobody wanted their money. Nobody really wanted to come out and provide good service. I mean, I take it that this is during the holidays and, peak times and whatever, but man, at one point, I know we're skipping ahead, or I'm skipping ahead here, but at one point they get on I believe it's an Amtrak, some kind of train, and it breaks down like almost immediately.
Right.
And instead of like Dagny Taggart would do, which would be to send an engine from the opposite direction or from the same direction and to push the train or to pull the train, they're just like, nah, everybody get out and start hiking through a cow field, and maybe you'll get to a road where we'll have some buses pick you up.
Yeah, my wife had the same complaint.
Yeah, that would just be atrocious customer service. And if it's Amtrak, then it's like, quasi-government, so they can get away with, not having competition, but just propped up by subsidies. But overall, this movie was for me, it was really implausible just from the idea that, other than the government issues, which are all completely real, the lack of care from the customer service angle bugged me.
Right, and that even plays back to that first airport scene when he gets on the flight, and the flight attendant's like, well, first class is full, you have to go to the back, and he's like, well, I paid for a first class ticket. And this reminds me of the recent kerfuffle that, people had been overbooked on flights and then had to be removed because they refused leaving, and we did a few articles about that on the site, and they had to physically remove one guy, and they got a little bit too rough with him or too violent.
Yeah.
Well, the cops did.
Right.
The security people did, not necessarily the airline people.
But even then, the airline should have known that that's the way the cops were going to react. Is cops beat the shit out of people. They don't hold your hand and say, okay, sir, we'll surge price in this particular instance and pay you $1,200 as opposed to the $400 we had been offering you.
But they couldn't, though. Isn't that right, Daniel? I remember back from the story that the airlines were capped out on the amount they could offer for a chair or for a seat. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I believe there was a cap, but I don't know if they had reached that cap in this particular instance. It's a little bit fuzzy to me. But the fact that there's a cap at all is an intervention in, voluntary options here, right? And
well, it was probably an internal control, to be quite honest. There was probably a company policy that limits payouts.
It may have been. I'll have to look back at the story. I'll link it down below in our show notes page, and there's a little bit more detail on it. We had an airline pilot also chime in and help with that article with some of the information that was provided, in, the carriage, contract carriage, or whatever they call it. Here I am, sounding like super knowledgeable about this, but it's really just because it came up. I worked with a pilot to piece an article together. But my thoughts were, well, it's their airplane. If they tell you to leave, you leave. You paid. They are going to refund you the money. They're going to pay you more than that. So it's not like you've paid and therefore they must. Because the agreement, every contract has an ability to have a remedy, right? If for non-performance, like here's what happens if we don't provide you the service. It even says like this particular ticket and this particular seat assignment is not guaranteed. It's we are selling you that we're going to get you from A to B, but not particularly when we will. It's sort of like to the best of our ability with equipment availability and all of this stuff. Right.
Yeah, I read things similar to that as well when the story came out of David Chow or whatever his name was. I don't know if I could add too much to that. The simple solution was, of course, that that they should have. They could have gone around to people and just started saying, look, anybody willing to give up will get $800 plus a refund or something like that, and then probably would have been the case. I think at some point they just chose, and I agree that it's their airline and it's technically their private property and they have the right to ask you to leave, but this so rarely would have had to even get to that. And I think even in this circumstance they didn't need to go where they did.
Right, yeah. If they had opened it up to the full plane load of people and said, all right, reverse auction, first taker, gets on the next flight and gets $1,000.
Right.
I'm sure they would have had a lot more, a better resolution and people willingly doing that without having to get physical in this situation. And it just reminded me of that in this movie, because Neil Page makes the argument, well, I paid for a first-class ticket, and you're going to make me sitting in the cattle car area, and of course he has to sit next to Del Griffith, who does all these obnoxious things, like his dogs are barking, so he takes his shoes and socks off, and you can imagine he's a heavier set guy, and probably not the best smelling guy.
Right. Yeah, he's not using cologne on his feet for for some good reason or something like that. He walks around all day. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, later, of course, the fact that the guy just doesn't stop talking at any point. He never, gives anybody any space. He's always got some sort of an anecdote in order to, hey, just 3-4 hours of talking. And from New York to Wichita is probably more like 5 hours of just straight plane flight travel. Neil later complains, didn't you notice that when I was reading the back of the vomit bag that I just wasn't interested in talking?
Yeah. What do you guys think of the fact that the flight had to get diverted to Wichita? I mean, that's sort of outside of the control of anyone, right? It's not, you can't land a plane if the runway is not open. But it seemed as if the airline didn't have any accommodation really figured out ahead of time. Like when I've had flight delays in more recent years, they put you up in a hotel, and it's not like they're as transparent with the information as they otherwise could be. It always seems like it takes them forever to make the announcement and then dole out the, here's your pass for a meal voucher, and here's where you're going to stay, and go get the shuttle over there and all that. It's always kind of a mess, but they didn't seem to do any of that in this case. I mean, there was a guy sleeping next to the garbage can in the airport in Wichita.
And sometimes that still is the case, actually. I mean, this is about a decade ago, but when I was still in college, first time round, so maybe this is about 2007 or 2008, I was traveling from Penn State, which is in State College, Pennsylvania, where you have a small little airport, and I was going to go home for Thanksgiving down in Charlotte, which is about a 500-mile drive, and I'd been used to driving it. It's about an 8 to 10 hour drive, but I was going to take a flight this time, and I got from State College to Dulles in Washington, D.C., but then a tropical storm had come through at that time, and we got delayed, and I ended up. It took me about 48 hours to finally get home because of the delays. They delayed the flight for 12 hours, and then they canceled it, and then it took me. I had to go and try to find a. I grouped up with this guy who was like an exec with Microsoft, and we drove down to Charlotte. It took us about 8 hours just because we were so exhausted that we had to stop to nap and get some food and stuff like that. And I ended up getting dropped off about 50 miles away from my house and had to wait for my parents to come get me. So I actually had a pretty similar experience to this, and it did take me a solid 40 hours to get home from only a 500-mile drive.
Wow, so this is almost autobiographical for you. That's
yeah.
funny.
Well, it's funny because I started off by, at that time in college, I was doing a night shift job. So I was, used to, staying up from 11 p.m. until 7 a.m. And my flight was 10 a.m. the next day. So I had already been up throughout the night. And then they keep delaying my flight from it was supposed to be noon until midnight. And I'm up the whole time because I'm trying to make sure I get on this flight and I don't sleep through it or something like that while they're calling for it. And they kept delaying in 15-minute increments for 12 hours. Did not put us up. Did not give us food. And eventually, when it did get canceled, I'm at 2 in the morning. I'm with this guy trying to rent a car. And there's this huge hour-and-a-half line to rent cars out of Dulles to get down to wherever you're going. And then you have 8 hours in addition. So it was, but that's why I say this is probably more of a people problem than it is a technology problem. It's
Was your Microsoft executive guy severely overweight and wouldn't stop talking?
Actually, he was, and one of the reasons I chose to go with him is at the time I was taking German while I was in college, and there was this German foreign exchange student, but she was only about 16 or 17 years old. And I had been talking with her in German for about an hour and a half, and she got to talking with this guy who basically was talking to her mostly because he was this 50-year-old guy, but very fatherly. He also had twin 16-year-old daughters or something like that. But when he was offering to drive people, he offered to drive a car full of people, and it included this 16-year-old German girl who didn't know where she was going, and I was like, why is a 50-year-old guy offering to drive a 16-year-old, somewhere, and so I kind of just sort of, I'd been talking with her, and I just sort of butted in. It turns out he did not have any negative intentions in any way. It's just, but I didn't know that. I was sort of like, oh God, this is one of those things where I think I want to include myself in this conversation just because I want to make sure that, this doesn't turn out bad.
So is that called white knighting? Is that what that was?
I don't know. I mean, I was 21 or something at the time, and it was like, but this girl was like 16, so it was a little more than, and I was already engaged, so I didn't really care too much about her, just interested in, I honestly was a little concerned that this guy was did not have the best intentions.
Yeah, so that story reminds me of a couple of things. Number one, regarding the technology and whatnot, he still was able to call his wife, right, several times?
Right.
And your story, you called your parents when you were 50 miles away. Well, there's a point in this movie where he's about 100 miles out of Chicago, and then they end up staying at this other motel. Why couldn't he just say, hey, wife, load up the kids in the 1985 Chrysler minivan and drive down to, Cowfield, Illinois, and come get me?
Yeah, there is a certain point at which the trip starts becoming a little too ridiculous. Like when he finally made it to St. Louis by the end of the first day of travel, he should have been able to get back to Chicago within 4 or 5 hours minimally, right? Whether he got a flight out of St. Louis, he had the rental car issue, and then those eventually got done. But St. Louis is it's technically about 300 miles from Chicago. But even on 1980s roads with 55 miles an hour, like worst case scenario, and when the car eventually burns on the freeway, there's a sign in the background that says Chicago was only 100 miles away from where they were currently at. And 100 miles is like 2 hours. It's not that much. So, yeah, he could have said, look, it got to a point where it was just like the first day is believable. The first 24 hours where, the train breaks down, then the bus breaks down, then he gets screwed with the rental car type thing. That's all believable. But when he's 100 miles away from Chicago staying at a motel in the middle of nowhere and has no money and has no car, just like at that point that's where things start becoming really unbelievable because they're just dragging it out.
Right, yeah, because after the car burns, then they stay at that other motel and they're 100 miles away, and he doesn't have his credit cards, they're all melted, he doesn't have any money. So that's when you make that phone call to the wife and say, all right, I have a quarter, use the payphone.
Right.
That technology existed, and he even used it in, I think, St. Louis, where he was like not even touching the phone because it was like too nasty, too disgusting to touch the phone.
Exactly.
But let's slide it back in time just a little bit to when they first get into Wichita, and Dell, he's an adept traveler, so he booked a hotel room right away as soon as they landed, and then they get a taxi cab to this motel or hotel or whatever, and it struck me that this is a market type taxi cab. It's like all tricked out. It's got all this decorative stuff in it. The guy's playing music. He's kind of doing his own thing. He's kind of a weird dude. He was taking them on a tour of Wichita at night, so they can't really see anything anyway. But It just struck me as the big contrast between this automaton style, every taxi cab's the same, versus this individual kind of one. And I don't know if that's like intentional. I think he was just trying to make Wichita look like super hick and super weird, but also super like skeezy because their hotel room gets broken into and they get robbed.
Yeah, and I think we end up seeing the guy who robs them like the next day. He's just some teenage kid who's like making out with his girlfriend in public, which there's 2 instances of that in the movie, and both of them are, it's if you're doing that, it meant to say you're sleazy, you're like, you're kind of gross, which debatably maybe.
Yeah, do you think that it was on them or on the hotel? Because I think, Robert, you had made a note to me that there was no additional lock on the hotel door, right? Just the standard lock? There wasn't the chain or the deadbolt?
Yeah, it's just the doorknob lock, which I've never been in a hotel, no matter how skeezy. I've stayed at a few skeezy hotels in my life, and there's never not been either that slide deadbolt thing or a chain at least.
Are we talking hourly rates here?
Yeah, hourly rates, minutely rates. I mean, a lot of things, unfortunately for me, happened in this movie that seemed to just for plot reasons, just to service the plot, just to have these guys have a whole lot of obstacles to get through and get past and whatever, and have hijinks and whatnot ensue. And unfortunately, they were fairly unbelievable for me. I mean, I would have rather had the crook noticed them when they walk in the hotel and say, oh, maybe these guys got some money, because otherwise I didn't even remember seeing the crook. He just appears to break into random hotel rooms and hopefully have people have some cash on them. I mean, that seems like a non-thief thing to do, like a whole lot of risk and not a lot of reward. Right,
they should have shown him casing them or considering them easy marks or something.
Or at least, maybe they're paying for the hotel room, and he, opens up his wallet, and there's a whole bunch of cash in there, and the thief just happens to be sitting, behind, kind of like looking over his newspaper or something
right.
In the 80s style, to at least say, oh, these guys are a mark.
Right, because they pay with credit cards, and there's that the mix-up with the cards, right?
Yeah, right.
Which plays into a little bit later. I wanted to make a point on, but continue.
Yeah. So then the thief just randomly picks a hotel room and gets lucky and doesn't wake anybody up, and is the easiest hotel room to ever to break into with like a knife, and he just kind of sticks it in the keyhole. And and then hijinks ensue, I guess, with the lack of funds and whatnot. And then they accuse each other of stealing from them, which I thought was perfectly legitimate. I mean, they didn't know that they had been robbed, so yeah, you must have robbed me. But anyway, it just led to plot points and dialogue and drama where it's almost inconceivably. I mean, this movie should have been called like a series of improbable events. I didn't believe. I could take a few of the things, like the finding a taxi was still an issue for me. I still think that there would have been tons of taxis on that street. I've seen pictures of New York, especially back in the 80s, where the taxi to regular car ratio is something like 70 or 80%. So it's just like taxis and limos all over the place and hardly a regular car. But whatever, it's a movie. But yeah, the hotel break-in was another problem for me.
Yeah, what do you think of the next day when the taxi cab driver sends his cousin or nephew to pick him up in his pickup truck, and he's got the wife who's holding the baby, and he's like, "Oh, she can get it. She'll get that trunk up in the back, no problem."
Yeah. Well,
that was one of the few things that I really enjoyed.
It was really funny, but it goes to your point earlier where they were trying to make Wichita look super hick, because that's supposed to be the motel owner's son, and the motel owner doesn't speak with a terrible accent. He seems to just be like a regular guy who owns a motel. And his son comes out and is like, "Yeah, the train don't come out of here unless you hog or cattle. But talking about skinny ass wife over here, she pushed the baby out of her sideways." I don't know. He's got this super hick accent compared to like his dad, who's just sort of like, "Del Griffith, you seem like a upstanding gentleman. Let me get you a room for the night." It doesn't seem. It's like my kids have the same accent I do approximately.
Yeah, it was a bit ridiculous, but at least, and I see your point about making Wichita look hick, which I'm kind of sick of those stereotypes too. But at least it gave the movie some character, some kind of flavor to it, where you kind of remember that scene. I mean, it's such a ridiculous scene that I enjoyed it. So, like, yeah, I'm going to have this little woman pick up this giant trunk. That was the one funny scene in the entire movie for me. I didn't think anything else was funny, but that one was.
Yeah, what did you guys...
I thought the Ray Charles scene with Del and the getting his jacket caught was pretty funny as well. And the whole going down the highway with Del turning into the devil and stuff like that. I thought that was pretty funny. Yeah, why he wouldn't stop and be like, "All right, both of my hands, I can't do the steering wheel, so maybe I'll turn to the side of the road and deal with this rather than risk death." Right, exactly. I think that had a lot to do with revealing about Del's character, that he doesn't think beyond the moment. So it goes back to like the beer on the bed, where it's like if you had put any thought into that would have been the case. Or if you had negotiated with the taxi cab driver, he wouldn't be driving you around Wichita at midnight trying to bilk you for every cent that he possibly can. Or same thing with with even the rental car. I'm sure you're going to bring it up with the switch credit cards. Call up the credit card company and ask for a number, or something like that. Or yeah, there are just any number of real-world, actual things that human beings would do in that situation that didn't get done to service the plot and for like whatever kind of comedic effect. And it didn't. The characters were so stupid, especially with the driving down the road and driving backwards down the road and all that, that I just started to hate the characters. And that's never a good sign. I mean, I know maybe this movie wasn't made for me, and someone who doesn't deal with a lot of travel issues a lot. I think people could have really identified with it more if you're doing that. But for me, the characters were just so dumb that I just ended up hating them. I wanted them to die.
Oh, jeez. What did you guys think of Neil Page? I think it's in St. Louis, where he there's no flights available, so then he goes to try to rent a car, and there's no car there, and it goes back to the customer service thing. The car's not there, and there's no way for him to get back to the rental counter, and so he trudges across the highway and falls down the icy slope and almost gets hit by a car. And then he gets to the counter and talks to Edie McClure. He's like, there's no fucking car in the fucking spot where I fucking tried to get a fucking car. And, he was like totally rude to her.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like a guy who finally kind of snapped, right? Because he took that out on her, and I think inappropriately, right? I mean, sure, her company didn't have a car there, but he certainly wasn't like the customer's always right at that in how he engaged with her. I mean, it's not really an ANCAP-y thing, but I think that she would have every reason to not want to deal with him acting like that. And then when, of course, he, out of frustration, destroyed his rental contract, and this is, before a lot of technology would have solved for this. They would have been able to look it up in the computer, or would have been on his phone or whatever. But because he had torn up his contract, he's like, well, you're fucked.
Yeah. I understand the frustration only because I've been there, where it's, like I've been up for 40 hours straight now. Just don't fuck with me. But at the same time, yeah, technically speaking, she as an individual doesn't have a duty to take this either as a representative of the company or just generally. But the whole scene is pretty famous simply because that scene in and of itself is what gets the movie an R rating compared to anything else. Everything else about it is PG basically. But yeah, I like that scene only because I've been there. But technically speaking, yeah, she could have thrown him out and said like, well, too bad, get out of here. And as a plot point, or as a suggestion for people in the future, if he had been nice in that circumstance, he probably would have gotten pretty far and gotten some sympathy. But because he came up and was like, fuck you, she was happy to say fuck off in return.
Right, and this reminds me of that famous Seinfeld episode where he talks about the rental car and like, well, you made the reservation, and I made a reservation for a car, so you should have a car here when I have come to get the car, his whole bit. But it also is similar, I think, to an airline seat where it's equipment availability and all this stuff. Like I've had a situation where they're out of whatever car I had reserved. And I think that's just because they only have so many and supply and demand, and they haven't really figured out how to allocate them, or shit happens, a certain car maybe didn't make it back in time or needs to be serviced or whatever.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just a general principle in life. To some extent we're living in a fallen world and there are scarcity of resources, and, these companies are making predictions based on estimates, but estimates aren't always seen. They have to live by marketable rules, which means sometimes they have excess and sometimes they have shortage. But general rule is, you got to have some aspect of go along, get along, because, it's going to benefit you 90% of the time, and it's not going to hurt you except maybe a few. Yes, maybe 10% of the time, they'll perceive you as being a little too pushover, but that's it. It's a business principle. I mean, it's a business principle is, keep a smile on your face simply because you never know when this person's going to be, a customer, or you never know when this person's, it just doesn't help you to be an asshole, even if you've had a really bad day, because that person hasn't had a bad day.
Right, yeah, and that's a good life lesson because you never know the person you're interacting with. If you're just coming upon them, you don't know if they're having a tough day already. So if you're going to come at them all shitty, I mean, who knows how they're going to react.
It's amazing to me that, my moniker on your website is the professional asshole, and I'm giving advice on how not to be an asshole.
Well, I mean, it's your specialty, right?
It is, no. It's the one thing I'm really good at.
So, related to how this whole scene with the rental car not being there happens, he had just parted ways with Dell, right? And they decided to go their own way. And so Steve Martin's character has this expletive-laden tirade with Edie McClure, and then he goes out to get a taxi all the way to Chicago from St. Louis. And the taxi dispatcher guy, or I don't even know what you'd call him, but he's like there at the airport and he's coordinating the taxis. He's like, you want all the way to Chicago? That's crazy. And Neil's still being a dick to him, or, being a dick. And so the taxi guy punches him in the face, and he falls into the roadway and almost gets hit by a car. The car happens to be Dell, having rented a car using Steve Martin, Neil's credit card. What do you guys think of that?
Naughty.
Yeah. Well, this is another thing that would be solved by technology, of course. Even if he only just realized that, I've got this guy's credit card. Let me call up my credit card company, or I can call up him and say, I've got yours, you've got mine, blah, blah, blah. But, if there's his only way to pay for something, and then he intended to pay it back, and as long as he had a reasonable expectation for Steve Martin to approve of his use of it in that situation, I would say it's not theft. But I don't think he did. So I tend to lay on the lines of that he was stealing.
I agree with you, Rob, that, if it's like if you find somebody's wallet on the pavement, and you have to spend $50 of their dollars in order to ship it back to them with security and insurance. It's not theft for you to have taken the $50 out and then maybe even compensate yourself a little bit for the time. But to take the guy's credit card and spend it on frivolous items and then give it back to him afterwards, yeah, obviously that would be theft. And I would probably give the benefit of the doubt to Dell. He doesn't seem like a sleazy kind of guy. Maybe a little silly, a little too gregarious, but he doesn't seem like the kind who would screw over Neil just because. It seemed like he was genuinely, like, I was planning on sending it back to you with interest, when I had the opportunity. I would have given him the benefit of the doubt on that, but yeah, he's putting himself in gray territory.
Yeah, he also was put in a situation where Neil split up with him, and their money had been stolen, so he didn't really have any other means available to him, and Neil refused to give him his forwarding address, and I don't know if that meant that John Candy knew that he had the wrong credit card at that time, or if he discovered it when he attempted to rent the car. I guess that would be a key piece of information, right? Because
you'd have to sign for it, right? You got to use the card, and then you have to forge the guy's signature.
Yeah, of course. The bigger deal ends up becoming when the car is ruined. I mean, Neil's the one on the line for that. Potentially back then. I mean, a car like that probably cost about maybe $6,000 or something like that for that car at that time.
Yeah, the wood-sided Town and Country. Is that what that was?
Something like that. I mean, it was not a luxurious car, other than it had power seats, which at the time was somewhat unusual, although apparently not very good power seats.
and a very resilient radio, as we discovered.
Very resilient, yeah.
Well-made radio. I want to know the brand.
Yeah, apparently it's GM brand radio.
So let's get into that part, because I found that kind of a fun scene, and we can pick this apart a little bit. So during the Ray Charles song, Dell's like smoking and playing along with the instruments, tapping the keyboard and doing the saxophone thing, and then he gets his arms caught and everything, and they almost veer off the road and die. But it's right around there where he flicks his cigarette, and he thinks he's flicking it out the window, but it rebounds, ricochets back into the back seat, and smolders for a while. And then when they're pulled off to the side of the road because they were going the wrong way after their spin out, and they almost get hit by the semis, they get like squished in between them, and John Candy turns into the devil. That the car starts on fire when they're out retrieving his luggage that spilled out into the road. And then they go to the motel room, and they have this like bonding moment where Steve Martin kind of gets over being angry with Dell because he's out there freezing and lets him stay in there, and they have this heart-to-heart talking about their wives and drinking these little mini tequilas and rums and whatnot, and they go to Jamaica, man, or down to Mexico, which I'm sure would get people in trouble today to talk like that in a movie.
Right.
But as they're leaving the motel, they're trying to rock their way out of the snow embankment, and they crash into the motel, and then they just flee. So, like, more wanton destruction. And I feel like that was also an inappropriate thing. I mean, I'm sure the motel is probably insured, but I would imagine that their insurance policy would have required that they have a legitimate guest there, because, I mean, he stayed at that motel based on, like, sharing his watch with the guy, like giving the watch. And I wondered if they considered that the watch was so valuable that they could raid the minibar as part of that or not, because he bartered to get access to the hotel room that night for the watch and like $17. But I don't know if that would have included the minibar. Seems like that would be an additional expense. So I just threw a lot out there.
Definitely would have been additional expense. But let me just make one point. So he's doing the dumb thing, and if you find it funny, great. I mean, it's fantastic that some people find this funny and some people don't. People like me, cynical assholes like me, don't find it funny. But just because he was being so stupid, and when there's a point at which you are putting other people's lives in danger for a joke is just not okay with me. So when he's driving down the road and he wants to take his jacket off and he gets it stuck and he doesn't want to slow down and stop the car to do it safely while Steve Martin is sleeping next to him, you're putting not only your own life in danger, but Steve Martin's life in danger, and that is just absolutely not okay with me. But So then he's driving down the road, and he spins around. He spins out. He goes off at the exit, and he spins out. And then he's doing all these, spinning around, and he gets all turned around. And he doesn't. I don't know if you've ever been turned around in a car. I have. You take a second to orient yourself. You take just a second and realize, okay, now I was just coming from that direction. I'm going this direction, and I need to go this direction. Which way did I come from? Oh, yeah, this way. You take a second, but he doesn't. He's such an idiot that he just blithely just gets back on the road, and he happens to be going down the wrong way. Now, I don't know what world he comes from. I assume he's a traveling salesman, so he's used to traveling a little bit. But who gets on a highway on the left? It's always done on the right. Always. Unless you're doing one of those little loop-around ones, but then you're looping around. You're always getting on merging left. Always in the freaking United States. I'm sorry. He should be accustomed to this. He should know. But he doesn't. He's all of a sudden he's getting on left and merging right, which should trigger something in his dumb brain, but it doesn't. And it should also trigger something in Steve Martin's brain. And then there's a whole scene where they're talking with somebody across on the other side. They're yelling at them, and they're just like playing it off like bleh. Anyway, just really super annoyed me, and I don't know. I guess I'm the only one that was super bothered by it, but that's fine. In terms of the mini bar, yeah, absolutely. They should have gone up and settled up and known that they wouldn't have any money. So you just take one for the team and you don't eat anything that night. It's fine, but in reality, you would have called your wife and they would have come down and it would have been fine. When they crashed the freaking hotel and then is bail, yeah, absolutely not okay. That is destruction of private property, and they're liable for it. Absolutely. I like to think that Steve Martin, after this movie's over, makes a few phone calls and wires some funds to some places. But also, What did you guys think about the cop stop where they just impound the vehicle? Because this is a government situation where they're like, they decide what's safe, whereas, these two people are deciding what's safe. I thought that was an aggression. If it was a private property situation and you're driving the car at, some unsafe speed on your road, then you have every right to stop this person and be like, whoa, what's going on here? You can't even tell how fast you're going. That's something you need to get fixed, obviously. But, I would give them the option or the chance to drive off my road, at a safe speed. It wouldn't have required me violently confiscating, the impounding of the car. With the statist world that we live in, I could see that being a law, but an immoral one. What I want to hear your guys' thoughts on that, though, and anything else that I've said and ranted about.
I agree that the private roads would have the right to prevent a car that's insufficiently safe from getting on the road because they may have liability or it may be liability to other customers. The impounding, not the case. I agree with you about the destruction of property of the motel. It's like, look, you traded $17 and a watch for this. You did not make up for this problem. I understand that you're desperate. You just want to get home. But, you had options outside of this, and I don't understand. I agree with you. I don't understand why when he's 100 miles away he wouldn't just call and bother his wife, who they seem to portray in the movie as being, I don't know, not terribly emotionally stable. Like she's crying because he doesn't get home from the airport in the right amount of time or something like that, and she's just absolutely elated to see him when he gets home. Like, you haven't been home in years. It's been 2 days. I mean, come on,
Right.
Yeah, she also seemed suspicious when he first called and said that the flight was delayed. She's like, "What do you mean you won't be home? What's going on, Neil? I don't get it. Are you seeing someone on the side?" That kind of a thing.
Like, as if being an account exec for a major company is not demanding work or something,
Right, and flight delays happen all the time. And she was in Chicago. She should have known that, it's fucking snowing, man. Like, they closed the airport there because it's so bad. There's like a blizzard or whatever it was.
Yeah, she seemed unreasonable, for sure. She seemed to be written for plot convenience as to have some kind of a conflict, as opposed to an understanding person, normal human being that would totally understand.
Yeah, absolutely, I agree.
And be concerned about her husband trying to get home.
Yeah, well, and not particularly demanding about it. And the only thing he's missing is one of a million children's plays that happen throughout a child's childhood, and maybe being an hour and a half delayed for Thanksgiving dinner or something like that. It's like I mean, I know it's a pain. You want to have it on this special day, but I like Thanksgiving. I don't put a ton of clout into it. I prefer other holidays personally, but obviously it's family together time. I get it, but you should be having that like at least a little bit every week,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ideally, but people live very hectic lives, and you don't get all the time to spend with family that you'd like to, and I can understand why she would be annoyed, maybe if this is something that's happened multiple times in the past. I wish maybe something in the script would have said something like that. Maybe chronically absent.
There is apparently like a 3-hour version of this movie somewhere out there. Like, this movie was originally meant to be much, much longer. So probably more like a Groundhog's Day, where it's like he's having an entire reorientation of his worldview and priorities during this trip, thanks to Dell, who, again, this is coming back to, what I think I said before about Dell, is that he seems to chronically just be incapable of seeing more than about like a minute in front of him. The beer thing, the credit card thing, the car thing, like he just does not take the option that, he's always living in the moment and only in the moment.
Yeah, I found it interesting, like when Steve Martin took that shower, because he'd been wearing the same underwear for days at that point. When he gets out of the shower, the bathroom is destroyed, because apparently Dell had gone in there and like left his dirty underwear and his socks everywhere, used every towel. The floor was sloppy, wet, and disgusting.
Yeah, completely inconsiderate. And the guy was just never considered, his traveling partner's needs.
Right, yeah. It's like he's a friendly guy, and he'll compliment you frequently. He'll say, "You seem like a real nice guy, man. I really just enjoy talking with you. Hey, how about I buy you a cup of coffee, a cocoa, and a drink to make you feel better?" Like, he'll do those sort of considerate things. Like, he'll give you things, but he's not very considerate when it comes to refraining from activity.
Right. I also found him rather dishonest when he was selling the shower rings to raise some funds by saying it was like Nelson Mandela's like whatever and
signature earring or something.
Yeah, making up stories for each one and selling them to these girls and all of that. That seemed pretty dishonest, and that was
it was a pretty major plot feature.
Yeah, and like a false advertising type fraudulent sale.
Yeah.
Sure.
I can't disagree with that. Other than maybe we'd always sort of be tempted to do the same thing if we were in a desperate situation with no credit cards and no cash.
Yeah, and it's not like this movie is like, okay, we're going to make an ANCAP movie here and stay true to the NAP.
Right, exactly.
But this is still a world where, like, Western Union exists, where, he could call up his wife and have her wire him some money. That's a thing.
Yeah, in the 80s,
it might take like an hour or whatever, but, I understand. A lot, you have to make the characters do dumb things in order for there to be a movie, in order for there to be conflict, because otherwise, he just gets home and nothing happens. But they just seem to do things that a normal human being would not do for comedic effect or for plot convenience, and it more annoyed me than tickled my funny bone, unfortunately.
Yeah. So hey, let's wind this one home. I only have a few minutes left before my wife needs to take off for this birthday party. So let's make it home. Dell finally gets picked up by Steve Martin back at the train station, where there's a cell phone ad and a America West airline ad about flying to Phoenix for cheap. So two interesting points I noticed in that, because the cell phone would have solved most of the problems in this movie. But after going on a flight that gets delayed, they go on a train, then they go on a bus, then they go on a rental car, and then finally on a milk truck to get home. And then Steve Martin's like become a new, more appreciative guy, and Dell's revealed that his wife has been dead for years, and he doesn't actually have a home because emotions, like he decides that he just wants to travel all the time now, or whatever it is. So yeah, let's bring this sucker home. What do you guys have for a final rating and review and summary?
Well, personally, I can't rate it black and gold because I don't think it's that good. I think it's a good movie to watch once a year, right around Thanksgiving, and sort of laugh with. Maybe once every couple of years. It's not the kind of thing I watch every year. I have other movies I'll watch every year. So there's something between red and gold and red and black. It's gold and blue. Like, you're a capitalist, but you're a Democrat. So it's like
That's a new rating. Yeah, I had a black and gray before on a movie where I wasn't quite sure which way I wanted to go with it. So like an agorist.
Right. Okay. There you go. Yeah. So I'll go with gold and blue. That way it's. It's capitalist and that's good, but it's Democrat and that's bad, or something.
All right, so not necessarily non-aggression, right? Mob rule.
Yeah, it's right. It's rule by tragedy of the commons.
All right, Robert, your summary and review.
Well, yeah, I hated this movie. I thought it was just a whole lot of nothing. I thought it was trying to be a comedy, and it never made me laugh, except for that one scene with the lady lifting the big trunk. But I did appreciate how the characters kind of revealed themselves through their interactions, and that Steve Martin kind of like showed his heart at the end where he invited Dell over to his house. I thought that was a really nice moment. Even though he didn't like this guy, he kind of begrudgingly has some affection for him, and took some sort of, I don't know if you want to call it pity, but just some kind of love type, humanly, love, sympathy for him, and invited him over to his house. So I thought it ended well, despite all the ridiculousness that happened along the way. If there's a 3-hour cut, I can only imagine the ridiculous things that must have happened to delay them that much. But yeah, big time black and red for me. I do not recommend this movie. I wouldn't sit through it again unless I absolutely had to, and I will not be revisiting it. I think that there's much better stuff by these two guys. I thought Steve Martin has been used way better in far superior movies, as well as John Candy. So yeah, I would recommend other movies that they're in, not this one. Daniel?
Well, I'm going to say that this was one of those movies that is sort of an 80s classic. It's John Hughes, but it doesn't age well. Like we've said, the technology solves this, and a lot of the problems seem to be somewhat believable in the beginning half, and then the second half of the movie kind of goes off the rails, so to speak. But I'm still going to give it kind of a nostalgic black and gold, because I do enjoy the characters, and I have a fondness for John Candy, who died shortly after this. I think Steve Martin's a funny guy, and it is entertaining for what it is. I mean, it's not meant to be like a hard-hitting, emotional movie or anything. It's meant to have like a little bit of slapstick to it. And then the other thing is that, what is the other thing? It gave us plenty to sort of dissect, I think. When we first thought about doing this movie, I didn't realize that there'd be as much to actually talk about to fill a nearly hour-and-a-half show. So good on you guys for coming up with good stuff on this. And also, I've just been informed by my wife that she has taken off to go to this birthday party without me, so we could potentially do some Kathleen Turner Overdrive if you guys are game for it.
Let's do it. I'm all about turning the frogs gay.
All right, we have the documents.
I've got dirt on Hillary, guys. I've got dirt on Hillary.
All right, so we're going to hear about the professional asshole's suicide shortly here. But before we get into Kathleen Turner Overdrive, I just want to tell you guys that this has been episode 50 of the Actual Anarchy podcast. You can find this at actualanarchy.com 50. If you like what we do, check us out at the actualanarchy.com/tipjar page, where you can find our Patreon link. That's at patreon.com/readrothbard. And also, we have a Thanksgiving special coming up that's going to come out on the 22nd, so the Wednesday right before Thanksgiving. That will have Walter Block coming on to discuss the movie Poverty, Inc. So that'll be a really fun one, really interesting. He wrote a paper on it, and so we're going to get into the economic nitty-gritty about that. But until then, wish you guys well, happy holidays and all that. May your safe travels be better than what happened with Neil and Dell in this movie. And we're going to go into Kathleen Turner Overdrive for our Patreon supporters in just a few moments. So thank you very much, and good night, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
The Chipmunks. CHIPMUNK. We're the Chipmunks. Guaranteed to brighten your day. Do 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 do.